All right, hey everybody. Welcome to lecture 2 of this ethical relativism module. It's our last lecture, and we're going to be talking about Benedict's Anthropology and the Abnormal. It's a pretty short little reading. It's only about 4 pages, so if you haven't given it a look yet, definitely do. So in this brief excerpt from Benedict's larger essay, she argues that the categories of normal and abnormal usually align to our feelings and our understandings about what is good and bad. And she uses a couple of brief examples. She talks about homosexuality and how the category that homosexuality fit into has not always been this, oh, it's abnormal, oh, it's abnormal. There's been different kind of displays of it in different cultures and various times throughout history. And then obviously our current mode, our current way of understanding homosexuality, normal or abnormal. She talks about that very briefly. But she talks about some other good and bad values, basing them on normal and abnormal. And, she argues that normality is most likely, not most likely, it is culturally defined. She said if we could ever get to this, like knowing all of the normal and abnormal behaviors somehow, if there's a way that we could ever encompass all of those, we're really far from that even. Because we haven't even began to examine moral values, Benedict argues, as like normal or abnormal. And she goes on to say that we can't bring everything into this sort of all-encompassing, oh, this is normal human behavior, this is abnormal human behavior. One, because of cultural biases that we already have. But two, because there are cultures out there right now and that have existed in the past based on totally abnormal principles or behaviors from our point of view, right? From their point of view, their principles and their behaviors and their beliefs are totally normal. She gives an example of a group of Melanesian islanders who had this set of beliefs and practices based around paranoia, extreme paranoia, or what we would call paranoia. And they essentially had a total ban for themselves and for everybody around them on sharing like food, on sharing gardens, on sharing utensils and stuff, because they believed that they were all out to kind of poison one another. They thought this was just something that was actually innate in their human existence, that if anybody was ever successful, it's because they used black magic to rob somebody else of their potential success. So that's kind of the way that they all interacted with each other. That's how they related to one another. And so Benedict, describes all of this to show that there are abnormal behaviors and principles that form the cornerstone of a lot of society, quote unquote abnormal, right? And that we shouldn't be so quick to evaluate moral values, right? We shouldn't be so quick to say, well, this moral value is good because either A, it's normal, or B, it just is good. I just have decided that it's good. And why is that? Well, it's because I'm coming from a place where I already have these pre-ingrained behaviors and principles and values in me from my society and from my culture. Right? I'm already biased. So for Benedict, she thinks we need to be approaching these things less like people judging other cultures, people saying, oh, like this culture is good and that culture is bad, or even like these values are good and these values are bad. And less even like kind of like, oh, I'll take some of these values and these values. Like I like that value right there. I'm just going to kind of put that all together and make a little moral value Frankenstein, right? But we should be treating them more like they are valueless, right? They're just certain inclinations, certain kind of first principles that at one point came about because of certain behaviors or practices from certain groups of people, and that's it, right? It's arbitrary, it's random. Your moral values are arbitrary and random. They've been determined by a past that you had no control over, right? And that's what she feels all people and all of their moral values really are. So what we should be doing is we should be trying to examine the wide plurality of moral values, seeing all these different ways that humans could be, quote unquote, expressing themselves. In fact, she makes an interesting comparison to human morality with human language. She says that morality is a lot like language. First of all humans are capable of morality, just like all humans are capable of language. But your particular language or your particular morality is a result of your upbringing, right? It's a result of the people around you. It's not that your English, if English is your first language, or Spanish or Chinese or gosh, I'm not going to French, some European languages, whatever. I don't know. There's a whole litany, right? But there's a whole litany, right? And it's not that any of those languages are better or worse than any other. That would be a strange comparison to make, right? And in fact, what we could be looking at is languages that are very different from our own, like languages that are very different from English, like Chinese, right? That has tones, that has characters instead of alphabetic writing. Um, it's just a totally different way of expressing yourself, right? It's not wrong. It's just very different. It has a different view. Same with morality, right? Our modern, for example, my modern American morality, my modern American sensibilities are very different than like American sensibilities perhaps 200 years ago. Now, there's a continuity. Mine were somehow inspired or influenced by those past American values, right? But that doesn't mean that mine are better than theirs or that theirs are worse than mine. It just means that they're different. And this seems to be a really tolerant way of approaching moral values as well. That might be something that we really like and strive for, actually, is tolerance. But we should be careful about that, because if tolerance is a moral value that we think we should be striving for, um, interestingly, that becomes kind of like a universal moral value, right? It's something that you feel like maybe you should prescribe to everybody. This also leads to some trickiness because, obviously America's past, to reference our example just from minutes ago, is kind of fraught with some terrible, terrible, terrible stuff like slavery and genocide. Um, so can we just accept their moral values as like being okay or being equal with our moral values right now? Is that really acceptable, or is there kind of this inclination to be like, no, like slavery was bad, the genocide of Native Americans was awful, and the moral values that surrounded those things was terrible as well, and we should not say, oh, like they were just different, woohoo. So relativism has some issues, right? It has some difficulties with it, and Benedict's relativism has some issues with it as well. However, I think we're all kind of inclined to already maybe sort of see the world, especially like culturally, the way she's describing. So one last thing I want to point out before this video ends, Benedict has a really interesting descriptive claim. Her descriptive claim is essentially this. It's what I said earlier, that we are all capable of morality. But her evaluative claim is this, that we should not evaluate some morals as higher than others. Rather, we should lean into cultural moral values, right? We should see moral values as an expression of human possibilities rather than as good or bad. And that has some interesting implications, right? I mean, if you were to see moral values more kind of as like an art, as a way of communicating, as a way of expressing yourself, as a way of humans expressing themselves in general, it's a really different thing. It's almost more aesthetic. Anyway, take a look at the prompt questions I have. Come up with a thesis, see what you guys think. I look forward to your discussions on, or your discussion posts on cultural relativism.